I'd like to come back to the area of the anthropology of the senses, an area that occupied me with the research I carried out in Papua New Guinea and have also carried out in other places, in Tucumán, in Argentina, for example. And as you'll recall, my trip to Papua New Guinea was financed in part by a grant from the Fragrance Foundation, from the Olfactory Research Fund. And that money that we got from the ORF also enabled myself and Constance Claassen and Anthony Sinnott, Constance being a cultural historian and Anthony a sociologist, to write the book Aroma, The Cultural History of Smell. And this book, which was published in 1994, was the first attempt to think about smell seriously from a historical, anthropological, and sociological angle. So it was a multidisciplinary approach to smell. Most of the research up until that point, as in the case of research on the senses generally, had been within psychology. Okay, and it was about how smells make you feel, and how useful smells are to telling you if something's rotten and this kind of thing. Well, I found that research very boring, and we found the elaboration of smell across cultures to be truly rich and engrossing. Just as one example, in Papua New Guinea, amongst the Umeda, a man will sleep with a bundle of scented herbs between himself and the sun. And the idea is that the herbs, the smell, will infiltrate his dreams. He will dream of the hunt and then just has to act out the hunt and will enjoy success. So very interesting. We have the idea of smell as an intuitive sense, but this was sort of working in that area. Also in Tucumán, when we were there were very interestingly these pillows that were full of scented herbs. So they were perfuming your sleep as well. And that idea of aromatizing your dreams, okay, what a lovely idea, I think. And indeed, there were many things that we experienced during our time in Tucumán. Maybe I can just give you one other example. This again comes from research in the early 1990s. The curanderos and curanderas of Tucumán in northwestern Argentina have all sorts of medical practices. Massage is very popular, but mostly they treat ailments of various kinds, including bad luck, by making little pouches full of different herbs, different combinations. And I have one herb here, and actually it's called muña muña, which is Quechua for love. And I'd like you just to smell it, okay, if you can. I'm sorry, there's no smell channel. I'm so sorry. I hope you won't feel slighted. But what's interesting is that this is from 1992, and yet still it preserves its scent. And if you tried to identify this plant by looking at it, you're not going to get very far. Okay? There's a whole tradition of botanical illustration in the West which has to do with morphology. But the curanderas and curanderos, they would identify what a plant was by sniffing it. And indeed, their classificatory capacities were extraordinary in that regard. And often, you couldn't distinguish one plant from another in these packages, but you could distinguish their smell. So you couldn't actually visually discriminate, but you could, if you had a discriminating nose, be able to tell. Anyway, there are all kinds of uses of smell, undreamt of in mainstream Western psychology. And we sought to bring those to the table through the book Aroma, which is still in print, and it's been translated into 4 or 5 different languages. It's a work of which I'm very proud, for bringing a multidisciplinary perspective to bear on the study of the senses and wresting smell from the grip of psychology. Okay, who studies the senses? Well, psychologists. Well, no. We anthropologists, sociologists, historians ought to get in there too, because we have more capacious imaginations about what the senses are good for, based on, not just carrying out research in a laboratory, but going and doing field work elsewhere. Anyway, it was while we were writing Aroma, and in the course of my field research in Papua New Guinea, that our interest expanded, to all the senses. So not just an olfactory anthropology, but a sensory anthropology, an anthropology of the senses, and an investigation into the ever-shifting relations between the senses, from one society to another. So already in the early 90s then, and there was a special issue of Anthropologie et Société published in 1990 called Les Cinq Sens, in which this idea of an anthropology of the senses was put forward. My contribution to that special issue was a piece called Les Techniques des Sens. Obviously, I borrow a lot. Here I'm borrowing from Mauss in a big way, Les Techniques du Corps. But Mauss doesn't talk about the senses in that wonderful essay from 1929. The idea that there might be techniques of seeing and hearing and so forth, he doesn't go there. It took until 1990 to really sort of put that idea on the table. And there was the work that we did here, but also especially Paul Stoller's wonderful book, The Taste of Ethnographic Things, The Senses in Anthropology, that launches the sensory turn in anthropology. And it's been growing steadily since then, as I'm very pleased to see. That sensory turn, I've actually, is reflected in a variety of ways. There is an anthropology of the senses, like the anthropology of the body or medical anthropology. It's a distinct subfield, but it's also a way of studying culture, I want to argue, and I'll come back to that point later. There's also, as a result of these openings within anthropology, but also within history, thanks to Constance's work, her book, The Color of Angels, which is about the senses and medicine and cosmology and art in history, begins this opening towards the senses on the part of disciplines across the humanities and social sciences. And accordingly, in the course of time, all of these different sort of subfields, history of the senses, geography of the senses, sociology of the senses, come together in an area that we call sensory studies. And sensory studies refers to, an interdisciplinary field composed of multiple disciplines converging on the study of the senses and prying them loose from the stranglehold of psychology, which has always been part of the challenge. And I would note that this goes further, because in addition to all the sensory turn within each of these disciplines, there are these interdisciplinary fields that have emerged, like visual culture, which is an interdisciplinary field looking at visual culture. There is auditory culture, or sound studies, which again is an interdisciplinary field focused on auditory culture. There is skin studies, or the culture of touch. There is taste culture, and so forth, the smell culture as well. So, the senses are everywhere. What you find is that what begins in the early 1990s with this, awakening of the senses, now they've emerged as a focus for research across the humanities and social sciences. And, that's reflected in this idea of sensory studies. And that idea was coined in 2006 in the introduction to a journal called The Senses in Society, which I have the pleasure of having founded together with Michael Bull, a sound studies scholar at the University of Sussex. So that was in 2006 that we founded the journal. And it's very much, an interdisciplinary journal where people from across the humanities and social sciences, we even allow in the occasional psychologist. Okay, not very often, but we do allow in the occasional psychologist share with us, what a sociology of the senses and so forth might yield. And Michael and I alternate in editing that journal, and I commend its many special issues to you. So 2006, you find the Senses in Society journal, and then in 2010, we actually sort of constitute, it would take a while for it to achieve recognition, a center here at Concordia called the Center for Sensory Studies. So 2010, and then it receives faculty recognition in 2012, and it receives university recognition in 2016, and we've now been renewed for another 6 years. And what the center consists of is faculty from about 11 different departments. There are 18 faculty and about 40 graduate students, all joined by our interest in the senses and exploring the senses in different avenues. We house the journal, The Senses in Society, here at Concordia. We have a number of research projects on the go. I'll come back to one of those in a moment. And we have also sponsored a number of international conferences, the Uncommon Senses conference series. It is a very dynamic field, and we try to offer a service to sensory studies scholars by continuously updating a website, the Sensory Studies website, that has information about new books and events and a picture gallery and a sound gallery and so forth. And maybe the latest chapter, if I can call it that, in this area is a book that is coming out later this summer. It's called The Sensory Studies Manifesto, and the subtitle is Tracking the Sensorial Revolution in the Arts and Human Sciences. It's coming out with the University of Toronto Press. And it's a book in which I track the sensorial revolution. So the first part of it deals with the sensory turn in anthropology and history, and then in geography and sociology, and also certain changes in psychology as well. The second part presents two case studies. One, a kind of survey of my findings in Papua New Guinea, and the other, a historical inquiry into the senses in the modern age, which is to say the period from 1920 to 2000. So I edited a book in the Cultural Histories of the Senses series, and you can see it here, in which I brought together a number of scholars, and we looked at the senses in literature, the senses in religion, the senses in medicine, and the senses in the marketplace, and so forth. 9 domains in all over the course of the 20th century. I was completely out of my league. I am no historian, but I had some wonderful contributors, and I think it's a really important book for sensitizing us to just how much baggage our senses carry, and how if you're going to do sensorial research, you need to be aware of that baggage and those biases. The final section of the Sensory Studies Manifesto is about sensory art and design. And what it does is look into, in part, in one of the chapters, a very interesting transformation in the field of museum studies, or what I call sensory museology. You're familiar with the museum as a place of single sense epiphanies. Okay? You go and you shouldn't talk too loud, you shouldn't wear too much cologne, you're not allowed to eat in the gallery, you just go and look. Okay? And that idea of, the museum as presenting a series of object lessons sort of begins in the mid-19th century and just dominates the field. There are various departures from that now, excuse me, which are very interesting to consider. But in the early days of the museum, 16th, 17th century, actually Constance's work has revealed in a book called The Museum of the Senses that a museum was not this place where you had to check all your senses except for sight at the door. Rather, the museum was a kind of sensory gymnasium. People were hefting things, they were gnawing on things, they were shaking them, and all of this was permitted. It was thought if somebody didn't do those things, then it was like inviting them to dinner and they didn't eat any of the meal. This was de rigueur, and that was because all of these senses were useful sources of information. Taste, because how else are you supposed to find out the chemical composition of something except for by chewing it in the days before Lavoisier? There are all kinds of ways in which knowledge of the senses was key. Well, all that gets shut down in the 19th century, continues for much of the 20th century. But now what we find is museums, trying to bring their exhibitions to the senses of the visitor. And very interesting developments in that way. All kinds of interactive exhibits, smell exhibits, and so forth. So the museum is a sensory gymnasium again. I'd like to just finish this section by speaking about two very interesting initiatives in this idea of museums as sensory gymnasia. One is a project in collaborative archaeology by a student who was also a PhD student at McGill, attached to the Sensory Museum project some years ago, Marie-Pierre Gadois. And what she did was invite Inuit elders who were in Montreal for medical appointments to come to the McCord Museum, and there, in a room, all of the objects that have been collected by the McCord are spread out on a table. And you don't have to wear gloves to interact with them. And so, those long sticks for braiding hair, oil lamps and ulus and model dog sleds and so forth were all there on the table. The gloves were off, and the elders, picked them up, manipulated them, and mentioned a variety of uses for them that the curators had no idea of. So, through the manual exploration, through a hands-on approach to interacting with objects, uses were discovered that had otherwise been forgotten. And these objects came alive again during these sessions. The sessions were filmed, were videotaped, and the museum actually makes it possible, if you want, to view these videotapes while you're looking at the collection. And so this has been a real expansion in our understanding of the meanings and uses of these objects. One last example, and that has to do with this slide of Iroquois Haudenosaunee, false face masks, like the ones in the collection of the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau. And very interestingly, the museum, actually almost 2 decades ago now, established a sacred materials program. And what that does is it involves 2 medicine men from the Six Nations Confederacy coming to the museum each year, and there they chant the masks, they feed the masks mush, cornmeal mush, and they smudge them with tobacco smoke. So smoke in the museum, food in the museum, chanting in the museum. What I admire about this program is precisely that, yes, all those things are allowed and considered necessary to taking proper care of the senses of the sacra. These are not objects in a collection. These are sentient beings, and if you are to treat them appropriately, then you must acknowledge and address them through the senses. That is sensory museology. So quite apart from all of the wonderful experiments in making museums more interactive, what I think has been important about this development is the way it's enabled us to recognize objects in museum collections not as objects, but as sentient beings.